Elizabeth from my email list wrote in, I want to do a simple beef casserole, just carrots, onions, using about 2 pounds of meat, and I understand that I need to saute first, but then I'm lost. And we all know that feeling, don't we? But 9 years of cooking with Instant Pot, I've pretty much cracked the code on this. So today we're going to make a delicious beginner-friendly Instant Pot beef stew, and along the way I'm going to share my 9 top tips for making stews in the Instant Pot, so you can stop feeling so lost, know what to do when things go wrong, and end up with, I hope, an amazing beef stew. So tip number 1 is to choose the most simple recipe you have or you can find, and then move on to some of those more complicated recipes you might have been eyeing up on social media. So today I'm going to use a very simple recipe from the BBC Good Food website. Not very many ingredients, and I'll link the original recipe below and also give you the ingredients that I'm using as I've kind of adapted this for the pressure cooker and for the ingredients that I have in the fridge. So we're going to be using some onions, some leeks, some fresh rosemary, some stewing beef, and we're going to be using some celery, some chunky chopped carrots, and some bay leaves, Worcestershire sauce, some olive oil, and then finally some stock and some wine. And this is where we come to tip number 2, which is the golden liquid rule for stews and casseroles when pressure cooking. So the thing to know here is that when we're pressure cooking, this lid is completely sealed, and so there's very little evaporation of liquid coming out of the Instant Pot as it cooks. And what that means is that we need less liquid to cook our stew than we would in a traditional recipe. And the liquid rule that I work to when pressure cooking stews is to reduce the amount in a traditional recipe by 1/3. So in this recipe I'm using today, it asks for 600 mils of stock. So I'm going to take 1/3 off, and that means we only need about 400 mils. Now what I have got here is I've got 300-ish mils of, I'm using vegetable stock because I don't have any beef stock, but I'm going to beef that up a bit with some red wine up to the 400 mark. So I'll pour that into the stock. And that will give a whole load of flavour. But if you don't want to use wine, don't worry at all. Just use 400 mils of whatever stock you're using. And then remember, formulas don't always work when cooking. So depending on the meat and the liquid content in that, dependent on the kind of veg you're using, some veg will release loads of liquid when cooking, some won't. So there is never a complete formula that will work. That's all just part of cooking. So remember to be a bit experimental, and if it comes out too runny or too dry, well, we've learned something. Write it down on your recipe notes, and next time try and adjust it a bit. But a good place to start, take 1/3 off whatever the liquid is being suggested in your recipe. And I'm Susan, and I'm here to help you cook good food, save time, and keep cooking even when life goes completely pear-shaped. Now on to actually making the beef stew, and my next tip is all about browning the meat to get an absolutely delicious caramelized kind of flavour to your beef stew. And you can make what's often called dump and go recipes in your Instant Pot, where everything just goes in and off you go, but I honestly think if you have the time, it's really worth taking this little extra step to bring all of that beautiful flavour. A thing to know about Instant Pot is the inner bowl is stainless steel, so super hard wearing, fantastic to cook with, but it's not non-stick, so you need to know how to cook properly to get the best results from stainless steel. So tip number 3 is to get this inner stainless steel pot preheated before you start to cook. But don't worry, because the Instant Pot has got your back here, and it actually preheats automatically. So let me show you what happens when I start the saute process in my Instant Pot. So to start off the meat, we're going to saute it in the inner pot, and to set that away we need to click saute. And I will click start. And now your only job is to wait, because the Instant Pot is going to start preheating, and then it's going to tell us when it's ready for cooking. There's the beep. Okay, so we know the Instant Pot is piping hot, and now we can add in some oil. And just let that oil get to shimmer point. Now here's where many of us go wrong, so pay attention. What we don't want to do is tip it all in at once. Work in batches and just put so much in at a time so there's a little bit of space between the pieces of meat, and that way you'll get lovely browned meat rather than a kind of grey steam meat, which is pretty awful. Okay, so now you can see we've got all of that brown loveliness in the bottom, and now it's time to move on and get on to this fast cooking. So let's add in our veggies, and you can add a little bit more oil in if you need to at this point. Just give them a little stir. The onions and the leeks. Oh, and the rosemary's gone in too. Now you can see all of those brown bits on the bottom, and if we don't do something about this, we're going to have what's called a burn notice. So this brings us on to tip number 5, which is absolutely critical. It's the deglaze dance. So what we're going to do, I'm going to take a bit of the stock or the wine or a bit of vinegar, and I'm going to add it to the pot and give it a good old stir to get rid of all of these brown bits on the bottom. Watch out for the steam. Yeah, I think that's all of it now. Oh, there's a little bit. Okay, so I hope you can see now that there are no black sticky bits on the bottom of that pot. Nice and clean. That's what you're looking for when we talk about deglazing. It must all come off. Otherwise we'll get a beep and a burn notice part through cooking. And a burn notice shouldn't be something that makes you panic, though it definitely did for me first time it happened, second time, third time, even now sometimes. But what it's actually doing is the Instant Pot is telling you that the food is getting too dry, the stew's getting too dry in this case, and you need to pay some attention and do something about it. And if your recipe calls for the meat to be coated in flour or mustard powder or seasoning, this might be a little bit harder work, but it's even more essential. Do not ignore it or you will have to deal with the burn notice. Tip number 6 is all about layering. We've got our veg on the bottom there. I'm going to put in our bay leaves. Going to put in a lovely sprig of rosemary. Tuck those herbs in nicely. And then I'm going to add in our meat as a top layer. In it goes. Worcestershire sauce. Now, before we do these final steps, let's talk about tip number 7, which is the tomato trap. Now, if your stew calls for a can of tomatoes or it calls for tomato puree, they are notorious for causing the burn notice. So if the tomatoes are on the bottom, they're very thick. It's just like when you're cooking in a pan. If the liquid is too thick, there's too much sticky on the bottom, it will start to burn. And on the stovetop, of course, you're stirring and keeping things moving. But the joy of the Instant Pot is you don't have to stand there and stir. The Instant Pot will manage it, but when you're making a stew with tomatoes, tomato paste in it, we need to help the Instant Pot out, recognise what it's doing and put those tomatoes on top so they're not touching the bottom, which is where the element is. So I'm going to take my tomato puree and I'm just going to put it on the top, and that will cook out any bitterness and allow us to stir it in later. But it's not going to be on the bottom and exposed to the high heat of the element while we're pressure cooking. So now I'm pouring in our stock and red wine, and we are now ready to go. Let's get this lovely stew cooking. So first thing, on with the lid. That noise tells us it's all sealed correctly. So tip number 8 is all about timing. So we pressure cook it on high or more if you're on an older Instant Pot, And in this case, we're doing it for 25 minutes. If it's larger pieces of meat, maybe 30, 35, then test it. Use an instant read thermometer if you're not sure. So we do it for the cooking time, but then crucially, we're going to just let the Instant Pot do a natural release and let that meat kind of ease on down. If it's not cooked when you take off that lid, you can simply pop the lid back on, put it on for another 5 or 10 minutes, let that natural release happen until it's nicely cooked. But 25 minutes, I'm pretty confident for this one, should be plenty. Now let's get this on. Okay, so we're going to set it on pressure cook high. And 25 minutes. Keep warm is on, we don't need a timer. Click start. And off it goes. And here's what I love about this method. Once you've set it away, you can go off, do your email, do some housework, care for a loved one, take a bit of a rest, watch a bit of TV, do whatever you need to do, because the Instant Pot is going to get on with the cooking for you. And you can set and forget. Even when that pin has dropped, if you've got keep warm on, it will keep it warm, or you can turn keep warm off and just let it cool down if you're saving it to freeze or to batch for later. And a pro tip on stews, however you cook them, they always benefit from sitting in the fridge overnight and then reheating the next day. Same with chilies, curries, all that blending of flavours. So never worry if it ends up in the fridge overnight. It's actually a good thing. So our cooking time is up and the pressure has released, the pin has dropped. So now we can have a look and see how this stew is. So I've stirred in that tomato puree, and this consistency now in the gravy is just how I like it. So I don't have to do any thickening on this version, but if you've been experimenting and yours has come out a little bit runny, a little watery, let's talk about tip number 9 and ways that you can easily sort this out, so there's nothing to worry about at all. So the first way to sort out an overly runny stew with the Instant Pot is, remember, it's not a slow cooker, it has a lot more functions than that. So what it does have is that saute function. So just as if it was on the stove and it was a little runny, we can bubble off some of that extra liquid within the same pot. No extra washing up, so just pop your Instant Pot onto saute and let it bubble away for a few minutes, keep stirring, and then stop it once it's got to that perfect gravy consistency that you like. Or another way you could do it is to make a cornflour slurry. So take a teaspoon of corn flour or cornstarch, pop in a little bit of water and make it into a smooth paste, and then just drop it into your stew, get that saute button on, stir, 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 and it will quickly thicken up. And then finally you could add something else that would thicken it up. Instant gravy granules or some tomato puree. You can get that in, stir it in, and that will thicken up your sauce. But what if I'd opened this up and it was too thick? Well, that one's a bit easier, isn't it? You can just press that saute button, add in a little bit of extra stock or another liquid, stir it in, reheat it, and off you go. But this one, it's come out just perfect, at least for how I like it. So we'll finish this stew off now, and here is one of my favourite moves, which is to add a bit of greenery in at the end of anything you're cooking. And for this simple stew, what better than a very simple vegetable? Frozen peas. I love these things. So we'll pop those into the pot. Oh, they're frozen into the cup. Pop the Instant Pot back onto saute, and you can either pop the lid back on or just let it saute off for a couple of minutes, and the heat will cook through those frozen peas in a flash. Extra fibre, extra veggies, why not? And you can now serve this up with some beautiful toppings to finish it off. Some nice crusty sourdough or a bread you like, maybe some mashed potato if you're extra hungry. Now that is a beef stew. And now you know how to go out making a lovely beef stew. You do need to know and understand what the burn notice is. It is the bane of new Instant Potter's life. So watch my video here, you'll understand it better, you'll know how to work with it, and crucially, you'll know what to do if you do get a burn notice, and you'll be able to handle it with some calm and maybe even a little poise. So I'll see you over there.